Anybody hungry?
Yeah.
I think as a chef you learn quite early on that you don't want to stand in between people and what they got to do. So I'm going to try to be brief and still relevant. Relevance is a really important word for me in this talk specifically. If you like food, you realize quite soon that you couldn't be living at a better time. Think about it, really. Think about every single dish that you love and how far we've come, you know, from our berry-picking ancestors to our cherry-picking critics. Food's gone a long way. Think about it. French gastronomy, but suddenly the French are a bit old. And let's take Spanish or Italian, Pan-Asian, Tex-Mexican, Japanese. Just think about it. Isn't it incredible? But generally we don't really think about it, do we? We just love eating. And when we love something, we don't try to break it down, we just enjoy it. But let's think about it for a little bit, because I sit right now as a chef, and the ones that think about what they eat sit as eaters. That would hopefully be most of us. In this big quasm, this challenging place in history, what do we do with everything that we've acquired as far as food tradition? That's a tricky question. Do we innovate? Or do we not innovate? So if we think of a black slide, there you go, all of this stuff, how far we've come. And cheese, I mean, and croissant. What was that first person to make a croissant smoking? That is incredible. What was he thinking? Foie gras pate. Foie gras, wow. Sushi. Oh, you can keep on going and going. Oh, this guy's my favorite, actually. What was he thinking? What a stroke of genius. This is the dish we do at the restaurant. So all of this stuff, really, I think we start looking at it, obviously probably salivating, and then think about it. At the center of this discussion of innovation in food and our position in history, where do we stand? Do we try to preserve all this stuff that we've developed? All this beautiful stuff that we've just talked about? I mean, is that what we do? Do we preserve it, or do we go forward? There's a movement now of purists and traditionalists, but there's also the techno-emotional chefs and the modernists and the molecular gastronomists. And where do we fare with that? So, to talk about tradition a little bit, and perhaps try to understand things, I think I'm going to talk about specific types of food traditions and exemplify them by their star dish. I'm obviously reducing food history to a few dishes, and that might be problematic, but whatever. Let's go there. That's what the purists would say. If you can't recognize it, you must not use it. If my mom didn't use it as a technique, then I shall not employ it, because that's, you know, against tradition. If there's a product out there that can make this twice as good and twice as fast, it doesn't mean that's better. I mean, speed is not everything. So let's talk about pizza in this framework, and let's talk about this great traditional Italian dish, pizza margherita we have here. Pizza margherita, let's talk about the cheese in pizza margherita, mozzarella di bufala, right? This is a heavily regulated piece of Italian cheese, actually. And one would say it's one of the most traditional as well. Fresh mozzarella, everybody loves it. You couldn't get it better. It's impossible. And let's think about the water buffalo and where it comes from. That's definitely not Italian, actually, if I think about it. The water buffalo, South Asia maybe? How on earth did it get to Italy? That's a good question. Maybe the Goths brought it over. I mean, Italy didn't really exist for less than, what, 200 years? History teacher, please help me. More or less, right? Well, so let's take the cheese off this traditional spectrum. Okay, maybe it's over, whatever. Let's take tomatoes. Tomatoes, you couldn't think of Italian food without tomatoes, but where are tomatoes from? Not from Italy. Actually, tomatoes were adopted by Italians, or the people that were living in what is currently Italy, quite later on. Most of Europe already had used tomatoes before, and if you think of Turkey as Europe, you'd see the first country, supposedly, or region, that adopted the use of tomatoes. So let's just take tomatoes out just for the sake of it, and let's move into things that really matter, like basil, basilico. Wow. Everybody talks about basil as like this foundation of Italian cooking, this herb that is so fragrant. People would say that if you smell basil so strong, it would give you scorpions on your head. Back in the Middle Ages, it was a really weird little herb. Basil is not from Italy; it's from India. So, there goes pizza, I guess. Well, then let's move somewhere else. Well, let's talk about satay. Satay for our Southeast Asian friends. We have a satay dish on the menu at the restaurant, and I often quote this because for me it's awesome. People get really, really strongly opinionated here about satay. They really do. Peanut sambal is what makes satay so delicious, right? And people will talk about it with great property, like it's something they sit on and own it. And the chili, and what type of chili and how much to use. Let's take peanuts. Where are peanuts from? Not from Asia, from the Americas. Some people say Paraguay, some people say Central America, but definitely not from here. So let's take chili. These you guys know, and I'm sure some of your students have heard of it in school. Chili is definitely not from here. Even though most Singaporeans would like to believe chili is from Singapore, it isn't, okay? It is not. Neither is chicken. Sorry, but it's true. It is very true. So, there you go. I mean, we took one. Obviously, this reductionist view is not the best way to talk about things, but we don't have that much time. So let's move along because this traditional dish is gone. So let's talk about tempura. In Japanese cuisine, I mean, such a tradition, and such a tradition that the Japanese themselves tend to uphold and protect. Tempura is one of the least Japanese dishes you could possibly think of. And it sits on a picture with koi, which is also not a Japanese fish. So pretty funny, but tempura and the idea of frying battered things came to Japan via the Jesuits, right? And the Portuguese. And if you think about it, it wasn't Portuguese either, because the Portuguese took it from the idea of a pagoda in Indian cookery. What am I trying to get at? I'm not trying to shatter anybody's dreams here, and if there are any Italians here, I truly apologize for what I'm going to say, but pizza, ladies and gentlemen, is fusion food, okay? At its core, really. And if you start thinking about it, tradition, food tradition, is fusion, really. And it develops and it grows and it propagates itself through the inquiry and absorption of other cultures. And you cannot, for a second, disregard that. You can't disregard that if our forebears thought about food in the sense that a lot of our guys and customers nowadays, and believe me, there's plenty of them, they think about, we wouldn't have pizza, we wouldn't have satay, we wouldn't have gratin, we wouldn't have any of these delicious things. I mean, think of gratin. Cauliflower is this beautiful European veg, right? No, it isn't. And we can take the list and just go bit by bit by bit by bit. And foie gras, which is so French, suddenly ends up in Egypt, being produced by Jewish people trying to get an alternative to schmelz or chicken fat, right? So the moment you start looking back a little bit, you start realizing that tradition, food culture, they were really created without the thought of being protected, but just the thought of A, creating pleasure, B, surviving. But rarely actually was there any thought given to what people were making. The idea is, let's make food tasty. Let's take this thing, oh, this is good. Let's put this here with this thing, and let's see where it goes. And then suddenly, when we're sitting on a bank of it, we then start questioning how to preserve it, because we must protect it from whatever it is that made it what it is. I think as a chef, this is incredibly crazy. And it's crazy for this one particular reason. If you take tradition and you quench it and you squeeze it and you try to mold it into this one little thing that suddenly stops breathing and can't really carry on, you take tradition and you transform it into heritage. And heritage is really dead tradition. Heritage is museum tradition, souvenir shop tradition. tradition is very much alive, and as a chef, the moment you realize that tradition is alive, you suddenly realize that it is only through the understanding of tradition that you can keep tradition alive, because you reevaluate and reapply tradition to itself. Tradition constantly needs new recipes, new bodies. Tradition constantly needs a new way of looking at the old thing, otherwise it becomes an Italian brasserie, or a French brasserie, or an Egyptian brasserie for that matter. So if you're thinking of heritage as nothing more than a museum fixture, the value of heritage is in itself proof of heritage's lack of relevance to today. And the only way that we can make food relevant to today is by looking back and not being scared of reapplying, reassessing, reevaluating, and recreating food. So as a chef, I take this dearly, because part of my career is built on my ability to keep innovating. Nowadays, nobody likes to eat the same thing twice. Rarely do people even cook at home. And suddenly you start thinking about people's aversion to cooking at home, and people's, maybe it's not even a conscious aversion, maybe it's just a laziness perhaps. But all of this perhaps is a lot more attached to our disassociation with the place of food today than it is with our lack of understanding of our heritage, you know. We know pizza, we know spaghetti if you're Italian, and we think that this is really what makes you Italian. But what makes you Italian is really pizza and pasta, but it's also the amount of Egyptians that live in Milan, and the amount of French people that have come to work at a restaurant, or the amount of Japanese. You'd be surprised, actually, if you walk at a coffee shop in Malpensa, the amount of Japanese that are interning in the art of espresso making, right? This is just as Italian. And the moment you start thinking about it this way, you realize that nothing really belongs to a single culture, and that your food tradition is yours, but it's mine as well. And that it is okay for a bold Brazilian man such as myself to attempt and have a go at a chicken rice and see what happens, you know? And only through that openness, only really through that awareness of what it was and what you wish perhaps that it could be, can we preserve tradition and continue to make it relevant. And I am sure, convinced to be honest, that this is how tomatoes, where is my picture of tomatoes? Bring it back! This is how tomatoes got to Italy. I'm convinced of it, that this is how every single bit that you now take for granted and you ingest and you pretend that is yours, this is how it was acquired. People weren't really scared of doing that, and neither should we. We should continue to use new products and continue to develop new techniques, and we will make plenty of blunders. But that doesn't mean we won't make a new pizza. I like pizza, and I like tomatoes. I want to keep innovating. Thank you very much.